agreement, perhaps ideally agreement on some kind of, national standardisation of content with the acrimony that exists between the states and the Commonwealth?
Oh, I don't know. It's not an issue that I really follow. I mean, it seems to me that the statements about Chairman Mao in primary schools are ridiculous, as Gerard does. And I mean, in principle, I'm not so keen on the Commonwealth Government taking over everything, mainly because I have seen it at universities. And the irony of our age is we're meant, particularly the coalition government is meant to believe in deregulation, but it's like a Napoleonic system, the university system, in which extraordinary amount of silly red tape and silly reports have to be done, and very little is improved as a result. So if that happens in secondary and primary education because of Commonwealth takeover, then it won't be nearly as good as Julie Bishop seems to think.
If we consider this topic in connection with what I've just mentioned, the 50th anniversary celebrations at Quadrant, it's interesting to note, Robert Mann, that John Howard published a piece in the magazine when you were editor, this was in 1994, where he talked of the need to do battle with Labor over history and ideas. Now, 12 years on, has he largely won that fight?
I think it's too early for him to be claiming victory. It's a little pond, Australia, and the victories that are won and lost are really won in a much larger scheme of things. And even though I think, that he's doing very well, largely because he's not under much criticism from the press, if you look at some of the issues that are connected with these big scheme of things, and one is US foreign policy and Iraq, and the other is global warming, I suspect that history will find a lot wrong with the Conservatives in Australia, and indeed with his Prime Ministership. So I think it's an uncharacteristic bit of hubris on his part to be claiming victory. I mean, the Cold War was won almost 20 years ago, and I don't think that needs to be celebrated now.
All right. Gerard Henderson, is the PM right to claim victory?
Well, I'm not sure that he actually claimed victory. I think John Howard's position is
that speech, wasn't it?
I thought it was a good speech, by and large. I think his point is he's made an impact, and I think he has made an impact. But this is an area where I think John Howard has been least effective. I mean, he's been very effective in economics, and whether you agree with him or not, and I've supported him on foreign policy, he's been very effective on foreign policy. But in the cultural wars, I don't think he's been very effective at all. I mean, he hasn't done what he wanted to do with the ABC or SBS. He set up the National Museum of Australia only to find out that it was, he later found out it was a museum to the left-wing interpretation of Australian history which he had imposed. I mean, if you actually look at what this government has done in the cultural wars, this is an area where they haven't made a lot of impact. I mean, the cultural debate in the level of the public broadcaster and in a lot of the newspapers, I mean, it hasn't really changed a lot. And humanities departments and universities, this is not one of John Howard's great successes.
In fact, the PM conceded that. He said the soft left still holds sway in universities.
Well, it does.
But in fact, wasn't that a comment in itself? I mean, what does he want? Total dominance?
No, I don't think he wants total dominance, but I mean, I think it wouldn't be about it if there was a pluralism in our universities and our humanities departments.
You don't think there is?
A lot of them, well, there's not enough in my view. I think there should be more.
Robert Mann,
I think he's made an impact.
Do you agree? I think you do somewhat, don't you?
Well, I mean, there are a number of issues. I mean, the way Gerard speaks before you ask a question is that somehow we want to have a country in which the Prime Minister, who's very good at politics but doesn't know a lot about all sorts of other things, should somehow dominate the entire cultural agenda of the country. I mean, pluralism is in fact having variety of things, and also actually in institutions having people that know a fair bit about that field making the appointments. And I think this image of the idea of a kind of Prime Minister with his kind of hand in everyone's pocket is a really worrying one, and I don't support it at all.
Well, what I was saying was he doesn't have his hand in everyone's pocket. I mean, he hasn't been...
He'd like to.
Well, that's a separate point. Well, I didn't say that. I mean, the fact is there's a whole lot of mythology. John Howard's not as powerful as many of his critics think. I mean, Robert Mann voted for John Howard in 1996 and told everyone about it. And since then he's done little except criticise John Howard. I mean, John Howard is not as good as Robert Mann thought he was in 1996, and he's not as bad as Robert Mann thinks he is now. He makes a contribution.
What do you know about what I thought in 1996?
Well, you wrote about it in your you wrote about it in your newspaper column on more than one occasion, and I happened to read it. But I think we don't want to exaggerate John Howard. Sure, he's a very influential Australian Prime Minister, one of the most influential of all our Prime Ministers, but he's not as powerful as many people think, and he doesn't get all the time what he wants. And it's not unreasonable that he would want to get what he wants. What I'm saying is he doesn't always get what he wants, and that's what democratic politics is all about.
Sometimes what he wants he ought not to want. I mean, I think if he wants to control every cultural institution, which I don't know that he does or doesn't, that would be a completely improper desire. I mean, one of the things about pluralism and about a society like ours is that all sorts of institutions should exist independently of the state. And I would have thought Gerard, who was a Liberal, would realise that.
Well, I did Politics 101 too. I mean, I know that, but...
101 is American. We don't do it here.
Well, as I have a look at it, I think you probably do. But what I'm really saying is that it's just mythology to present John Howard as this all-dominant factor. I mean, all politicians want to achieve things. That's true on the Labor side, it's true on the Liberal side, it's true on the Green side. What I'm saying is they don't all achieve things, and John Howard hasn't been as influential as a lot of his critics say. And if you actually speak to people who know him well, that's what he would privately acknowledge. Sure, he's made a big contribution in the debate, but he doesn't dominate the debate, and he knows he never will dominate the debate.
All right. Let's just broaden the discussion a little bit. If Quadrant has been fighting as they feel they have the good fight for 50 years, are there any challenges on the horizon? To you first, Robert Mann. Any challenges on the horizon to, if you like, the prevailing conservative ethic? And I'm thinking there really of economic liberalism and the ethic of individualism.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of challenges, actually. One, I was really taken this week with not only with Kevin Rudd's piece, which I knew about, but also with Archbishop Jensen, who I don't normally agree with, although I respect. I mean, he said that the Liberal Party has to listen very carefully to what Kevin Rudd's saying. What Kevin Rudd's saying is there is a real conflict between neoliberal economics and the individualism of the society based on that kind of idea, and the sort of moral conservatism that is at the heart of a lot of the things that the Howard government and others around it believe in. Family, a leisurely life, the capacity to have relationships not entirely dominated by work. And I think that is a really important challenge, which Kevin Rudd actually broke through in a very useful way. And I think it's been quite interesting that at the moment the heavy hitters in the Liberal Party haven't really known what to say about the Rudd intervention.
All right, Gerard Henderson, did you have a look at that? And do you see it as some kind of alternative, perhaps, that's shaping up to the Conservative message?
Well, I respect Kevin Rudd, and I think it was a good article, but I don't know where it's going to take Labor. I mean, one of the matters that Professor Mann overlooks is that he's essentially opposed every economic reform in Australia of the Hawke government, the Keating government, the Howard government. But in this period of 25 years nearly of economic reform, what we've done in this country is halve unemployment. There's been massive wealth creation. The society's got its problems, but we're doing pretty well. Now, I don't really think that Kevin Rudd's contribution is going to affect this much whilst the economy remains strong. And there's another point.
Why not? Because, I mean, he's arguing, actually, that yes, there's the prosperity, we're not arguing about that, but there is something larger that we can do that takes us beyond self-interest. And he's tying that to a more engaged internationalism on a number of fronts, global warming, the international rules of engagement, all sorts of things. I mean, there's an altruism about that.
You can talk about the environment, and that's okay. But, I mean, we've seen other alternatives to the Australian and the American and the British and New Zealand economic model, and we see them in France, where unemployment's 10%, 20% among the youth, in what the Sydney Morning Herald, in a report today, has described as, in a sense, an intifada in the outer suburbs of Paris among young Muslim French people. The unemployment is probably 40 or 50%. What we've done in Australia and other Western democracies over the last 15 years is to halve unemployment down to areas where it's in a satisfactory range. You'd like it to go lower.
I don't hear Labor arguing about that. That's not the area of contestability anymore,
but then what is Kevin Rudd trying to resolve? I'll tell you where Kevin Rudd will run into a problem, because in that article, what he doesn't talk about is his own personal morality. He said personal morality is not really totally connected with the teaching of the gospel. But what people in the...
as you know, he's addressed that on a number of occasions.
Yeah, but, well, has he? I mean,
he's addressed it on key issues in the Parliament.
Well, let me tell you what he hasn't addressed.
Interviews on Compass.
Let me tell you what he hasn't addressed. What people in the outer suburbs and the regional centres among the fundamentalist Christians that he's looking at targeting want to know is, what's his attitude on abortion? What's his attitude on same-sex marriage? What's his attitude on stem cell research? Now, on these issues, he hasn't got into that debate, and quite frankly, I don't get into that debate either. I understand his position. But Archbishop Jensen's real followers, they're real fundamentalist Christians at the moral end. At the economic end, they're Calvinist. I mean, if you boil down that group, I mean, essentially they're Calvinists. But what they will really want to know is where does Kevin Rudd stand on these issues of sexual morality, which he declined to discuss in the monthly
well, he did
essay.
in that. But as he said in a follow-up interview on Lateline on Monday night, this is more than about the life issues, which is where the debate always ends up in a kind of cul-de-sac.
Yeah,
he was trying to broaden it.
Yeah, but you're not telling me that Kevin Rudd's going to go to the outer suburbs of Brisbane, Melbourne or Sydney and advocate same-sex marriage in the marginal seats or the regional centres, is he?
No,
I don't think so. Or advocate abortion. I don't think so. And this is the point. I mean, in the monthly essay, it's a very good essay, and I think people should read it. But he steps away from the real issues in which people like Tony Abbott are involved, and in a slightly different way, Peter Costello was involved, and in another way, Kim Beazley and Wayne Swan are involved in this. I mean, Kevin Rudd's not the first Labor spokesman to get involved in religion, because Kim Beazley and Wayne Swan are deeply involved in that and have been for a long time.
Robert Mann, sorry, please.
I mean, the thing that Kevin Rudd is trying to do, as far as I understand it, is to say that exactly what Gerard is saying is a distortion of the way in which Christians can relate to the political process. There is one, and he would think the right-wing Christian version, which is to be only interested in abortion and stem cell research and so on, same-sex marriage, they're interesting issues. I mean, he's trying to make a claim that there is a deep tradition in Labor, which is partly Irish Catholic, which Gerard knows about, and partly Methodist and so on, in which there is a really great interest in issues of social justice and in questions of what happens to the dispossessed. And he wants now to include, I think completely rightly, that tradition should link to things like climate change and the possible catastrophe that we're facing. So what he wants to do is to say that one version of how Christianity links to politics is not the only version. I doubt if he thinks he's going to win over the new evangelical movement in the outer suburbs, but Gerard should know that Christianity is a small part of the society, and in fact the evangelicals and so on are a smaller part of that. And can I say something that I think is more important? And that is that what happened to Kevin Rudd when he began to speak about Bonhoeffer and began to speak about Christianity and politics it's not so much that he's thinking about what Christianity can do to politics. He began to speak, because of thinking in that language, in a sort of way that I don't think any Labor leader since Paul Keating has been able to speak. But what's interesting about Kevin Rudd is that he speaks in a proper sort of timbre for the conservative times we live in. He's a much more conservative figure, I think, than Paul Keating. And he's speaking, I think, in a really interesting way, breaking through the sort of dreariness that has inhabited politics over the last 10 years. It was one of the first things I've read in politics for a very long time, coming out of Labor or the Conservative side, which actually had a bit of passion and a bit of feeling for the larger issues. And religion broke through some of the natural kind of inhibitions that we've come to accept as the normal part of our political discourse.
And Robert
Mann,
does the political scientist in you suggest that in fact that could appeal, that kind of elevated message could appeal to a broader alliance of voters?
I think it could, because I just don't believe that Labor since 1996 has had any picture or story to tell.
All right.
I mean, what Beazley has looked like is a pale and mild version of John Howard, who probably doesn't in any fundamental way disagree with him. And Kevin Rudd sounds to me, because he talked about Bonhoeffer, suddenly to really disagree on fundamental matters of value.
I think the more important point in this debate was actually made by Bill Shorten after the last election, who's now a Labor candidate at the next election. And Bill Shorten said that what you need in the Labor Party is the inner city leftist in the Labor Party not laughing at people who favour an intact marriage, who want to send their kids to private schools and who want to go proudly to church on Sunday. I think Bill Shorten's got a much sharper point. The problem is this division in the Labor Party between an inner city left-wing group who are not that far off the Greens and others in the party who used to vote for the party, and the party's lost because the kind of values they hold are being ridiculed. Now, this group also happens to be fairly conservative on moral issues. Now, I'm not certain that Kevin Rudd's going to get where he wants to get. Without having said that, I think it's an interesting essay, and I think it's good that we're debating these points.
Can I say something about that? I think that I agree with Gerard, and I've often argued the same thing about that divide, which I think has crippled the Labor Party. This is the first intervention I've seen which looks like it might bridge that gap to some extent. It requires from the left-wing intelligentsia in the inner suburbs to be a bit quieter and a bit more thoughtful than they've been in the past. And maybe it also requires from the people in the outer suburbs to think about the world beyond only their family and their individual needs. And I thought it was actually a bridging kind of article.
It's interesting you're both having this conversation, though, while I saw in the papers today one of the more recent speeches that David Cameron, the new head of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, is making, and this is an inclusive Blairite message about the Tories having to get comfortable about things like gay marriage, single mums, care for the planet. This is a new centrist message.
Well, David
Which is
Cameron's
interesting.
decided to go that way, but it's 3 years at least to the next election in Britain, and it's not at all clear whether this will work. I mean, particularly in a situation of voluntary voting, some of the real Conservatives in Britain may just stay home and not support this. I mean, we don't know how this is going to work out. I think, by and large, the position of the contemporary Conservative Party is pretty contemptible, and in my view. I mean, how having supported the commitment in Iraq, they now want to walk away from it. I mean, I'm not a fan of the Cameron Tory Party, but whether it's going to work or not, I've got my doubts. I mean, I think Labor can recover in Britain.
Gerard, I want to ask you about, I asked Robert before about challenges to conservatism. You have another concern, don't you? When you look at Europe, you see a challenge coming from the far right, don't you?
Well, I'm concerned that, in my view, the left is, by and large, not all of the left, but the left is far too soft on radical Islamism. And my concern is that if that continues, what will emerge is a revamped right. Le Pen in France, Haider in Austria. There are also these movements developing already in Belgium and in the Netherlands and some other part of Europe. And I'm concerned that if the left continues this kind of flirtation with Islamism because it's an enemy of Bush and Blair and Howard, then what you will get is a movement strongly coming from the right. And so I think there are concerns to our democracy, and that's why I hope this won't come about. But I think it's a matter of some concern.
Robert, what do you think of that point? Especially when you look at Europe.
I think Gerard's point is wrong. I think it is true that the left doesn't concentrate enough on Islamism and concentrates on the Bush disaster in Iraq. And I think the right concentrates on Islamism and doesn't think enough about the Bush disaster in Iraq. In my view, both groups should think about both. But if I asked Gerard to name one person in Australia who is a supporter of Osama bin Laden, I'd be surprised if he could name one. I think this is a complete... During the Cold War, the left did sympathise with communism, or even worse.
Well, if I can just
in the war on terror, there is virtually no one on the left who sympathises with Osama bin Laden.
Well, firstly, I mean, that's a slight distortion of the argument, but if you actually say that there's, which is what you said originally, that no one in Australia supports Osama bin Laden, I mean, we can't go into this, but there are people standing...
No one on the left.
Well, that's your second point. You started off by saying no one in Australia.
Well, I meant on the left.
OK, well, if you're talking about the left, there is a very vibrant group among the civil liberties lobby who maintain that concern about Osama bin Laden is exaggerated. Concern about terrorism is exaggerated.
Who are you thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking of someone, for example, like Julian Burnside, who's
I
written...
don't believe that for a moment that he says that.
If I could just finish, who has written in your own magazine, The Monthly, that there's a line between the Dreyfus affair in France and what Philip Ruddock's trying to do in Australia. Now
but on the grounds of civil liberties.
If I could just finish, what that demonstrates that Mr Burnside knows nothing about contemporary Australia or about France of a century ago or about anti-Semitism in France or what led from Dreyfus to the Vichy fascist regime. Knows nothing about that. So what I'm saying is there's a whole group in the civil liberties lobby who are actually saying that people who are concerned about terrorism are exaggerating, which is exactly what the left said in a different perspective. What the left said years ago, that people were exaggerating about communism, and during the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact, that they were exaggerating about communism and Nazism, and the fact is they weren't.
Robert Mann?
I think the analogy is ridiculous. The people like Julian Burnside, who I know well and respect very deeply, do not say that terrorism is not a real threat or the jihadists are good people. What they say is that we in Australia have to be careful not to have our whole legal system, our whole belief, for example, since the 17th century that torture is wrong, distorted by the enemy we face, that we can lose a lot that we value because of the nature of the enemy we face and because of the response we might mistakenly make towards it. I do not believe for a moment, and I think it's quite wrong, to say any of the people that you have in your mind is a supporter of Osama bin Laden or anything else, in the way that, as Gerard and I know damn well, lots of people on the left were enthusiastic supporters of the other side. The analogy that Gerard is now making, and will go on making, I take it, is very unfair and very wrong to the civil libertarians, and is a distortion, much more importantly, of the political factors at work here.
Well, what's influenced my argument here is not a right-wing historian or commentator, but Fred Halliday, the British commentator and historian, who's a critic of Bush and Blair, who has made this point about the left. He's actually said that the international left is essentially sucking up to Islamism because they see it as an anti-imperial force, and they see Bush and Blair as the embodiment of Western imperialism, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that kind of thing. Now, it's not me that started this. I mean, people can read Fred Halliday's speech. It's a very good article. And if they want to, if they want to look at the other end
Gerard,
of it,
you're talking as if the left is united. The left is a fragmented beast in many ways, as is the right. The right is split on this issue, as is the left. I could nominate any number of left individuals who in fact are vehement opponents of militant Islamism.
Well, give us some names internationally. I can give you names on the other side. I mean, who are they?
Internationally,
there are a couple of
Christopher Hitchens is leading.
Well, he wouldn't call himself. He wouldn't call himself on the left anymore. In Australia, there's some social democrats. There are people like Jim Nolan.
He probably calls himself a contrarian.
There are people like Jim Nolan.
Okay.
But
he is.
Give me the name, any name of a figure on the Australian left who has stood up on the terrorism issue, including the need for counter-terrorist legislation. You haven't stood up on the need for counter-terrorist legislation.
You nominated Jim Nolan, who was writing in The Australian the other day.
Jim Nolan doesn't regard it... But hang on, just a minute. Jim Nolan does not regard himself on the left anymore. He's contemptuous of the left.
He was writing on behalf of the left the other day, and he opposes the jihadists,
I was talking to him this morning, and he actually...
as do many others.
Well, I was talking to him this morning, and he actually said he was contemptuous of the left because none of his colleagues were going with him. There are a few people. There are social democrats like Michael Costello in The Australian. But by and large... But he doesn't regard himself that way now. He regards himself as a social democrat. But by and large on the left, there is virtually no one. And the situation in Britain is worse than it is in Australia. Now, of all these people around, it's pretty easy to name them. The left has effectively gone under on this issue because they don't want to seem to be associated with Bush and Blair and Howard, who they absolutely hate. And because of their hatred for that, they've gone quiet on the issue.
Robert Mann?
Well, I'm trying to make a distinction which is a subtle one. I think it is true that a lot of people on the left have not concentrated or written enough about the jihadist threat. As a matter of fact, I have in a couple of months ago in The Monthly. I don't write about counter-terrorist legislation because it's not my field and I'm not a lawyer and I don't pretend to be. But in fact, I would not take the position that Julian Burnside and others do. I think there's a role for some legislation within certain frameworks. But I do think it is true that the left ought to concentrate more on jihadism, but that does not mean that the left supports jihadism, and that's a slide that Gerard and many people like him are going to make, and I think it's very, very misleading.
I don't know how you know what I'm going to say. But...
Well, what you've been saying this week, and what you've been saying tonight, as a matter of fact. On the other hand, I think it's also true, and should be said, that people on the right, the Quadrant Group, apart from Tom Switzer and Owen Harries, ought to face up to the fact that they were disastrously wrong on the Iraq War, and Gerard was as well.
Okay.
Well, I'm not a member of the Quadrant Group. So.
Okay, gentlemen, we are
you were
well
wrong
and truly
separately.
We're well and truly out of time. But I'm very glad you both came together for this discussion tonight. I hope you'll
it's just like old times.
Repeat this exercise. It was great to see you both here. Thanks very much. Well, things didn't entirely go to plan at the Telstra pitch to analysts today. A misfiring sprinkler system stole the show. Just as the Telstra boss was delivering his final sales pitch before Monday's T3 launch, the stage was flooded and the venue had to be abandoned. Nevertheless, the market responded positively to the company's plans and Telstra shares ended the day higher than they've been in some months. Philip Lasker reports.
With the sale of the last slice of the government's shares in Telstra imminent, the company's super salesman, Sol Trujillo, was not given to understatement.
I believe today's a very important day in Australia's history.
It was a day Telstra chose to switch on its new high-speed wireless network, the next best thing since the company shelved plans to upgrade its broadband network after battling the regulator. The NextG network, built in just 10 months, delivers voice, data and pictures on mobile phones to 98% of Australians at speeds 5 times faster than is currently possible.
There's no question that data growth is the primary success story behind the mobiles business, and that the forecasts of higher average revenues per user around content downloads, more messaging, and really all those non-voice services that we talked about is a very rosy prospect for the company.
But later, the simpler technology of a misfiring sprinkler system sent Sol Trujillo and market analysts running for the exits.